Hello, everybody. I think we can start now. So again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Happy to see you all here. I think we're tackling a topic today that everybody roughly knows about, at least the GDPR part. So if I look at what I'm going to present, I'm actually giving a very brief overview, really rushing over the GDPR part, what the legal part is, then going to the IAB transparency and consent framework, touching then the InApp API, and at the end we will do a Q&A. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions in between, because we can already prepare answers and maybe go into some of these while we do the main webinar. Okay, one thing that needs to be stated in the beginning, nothing of this is a legal advice. So check with your legal advisor with anything about GDPR. Let's start with a brief overview. So the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union is going to be effective and enforced on May 25th. And it's actually been there since roughly 2 years. It applies to all residents of the European Economic Area and Switzerland. That also includes everybody on the British Islands, well, Britain. So after the Brexit, they are still having GDPR, or they actually might choose to reverse that. Also, anybody on European soil is affected. The processing of all personal data is regulated in this regulation. And it includes a pretty broad definition if you compare it to anything that was in place before. So it specifically mentions IP addresses, identifiers like advertiser IDs or geolocation data, but also combination of data points that lead to re-identification of one person still makes it PII. The definition of what is anonymous data that does not fall under GDPR is actually pretty small. So it can be very highly aggregated data, or really data that has no background, but it's limited what you then afterwards call anonymous data under GDPR. Why everybody is so interested in this topic and talking so much about it are, I guess, the big fines that are also stated in the law, which go up to 20 million or even 4% of the global revenue if that one is higher. The two key concepts that are introduced with the GDPR are first the roles of a data controller and a data processor. So a data controller, and many of you or most of you will be publishers and actually be data controllers in that sense of how you act with your users' data. And then there's data processors. So the data controller decides how data is collected, what data is collected, and what the purpose is. And the data processor is limited to what a data controller actually tells him to do. So it also imposes certain requirements. For any data that you collect, you need a lawful basis. There's actually 6 of them, and the 2 ones that are most interesting for our business are legitimate interest and consent. So legitimate interest is basically what you can guess, your legitimate interest to make some money or to monetize your inventory. A consent is needed once it impacts a bit more on a user's life. So it specifically states about profiling and automated decisioning with a higher impact on a user, or actually here in this called data subject. It also introduces certain data subject rights, especially about access and deletion. So a user might ask you as a publisher, us as ad tech vendor, what data have you stored about me? And you have to actually hand it out. They may also ask, please delete anything that you have stored about me, because I don't want to have any business with you anymore. I don't want to have anything to do with you. So some of you might have heard about the e-privacy regulation. This is still not in place. There's currently a e-privacy directive in place within the EU, and this is actually a bit modified by the GDPR. So the GDPR, in conjunction with e-privacy directive, requires a consent to access an advertiser ID or any other identifier, at least as identified by the lawyers of the IAB and also our lawyers. Again, please ask any questions that you have already now. So as stated, we can collect them and answer maybe already now. Going over to Smaato, we determined that we actually act as a controller, or we have to act as a controller, as we collect certain data independent of the publisher. We are of course, very limited in what we do there, but we have certain decisioning processes that are so near term and cannot be regulated in a very narrow way, so that a publisher could tell us to Smaato, and we still act as a data processor. We as Smaato, we fully adhere and support the IAB GDPR consent and transparency framework. And we get to the point of getting really into the detail a bit later on. And we will totally adhere to the user's choices and also to your choices as a publisher, because you limit actually the choices that a user at the end has. Our SDK is already out and updated, actually released on May 8th. Both versions will collect automatically using the new mobile in-app CMP API from IAB, and we'll use it in the full ad request process. We actually were very active in the IAB and the IAB working group, working together with several vendors, how this could be tackled, how we actually provide a solution that is providing the best experience for you as a publisher, but also to the end user, so that the consent is actually just asked once and not in, let's say, 5 or more different iterations because you choose to work with 5 vendors. Our ad tag is also providing parameters, so you can add the same information and communicate it through the whole ecosystem. So this is a picture of our decisioning flow of what we do with a ad request that you send us. It will, based on several parameters, determine if we still do targeted advertisement or allow our demand to do targeted advertisement, or if we fall back to context advertisement because of the before mentioned restrictions of the GDPR. So if we decide at the end, and that is lower right, to fall back to context advertisement, meaning no profiling is allowed, no automated decisioning with a higher impact, we drop any PII, that is age, gender, location information, identifiers that you might have sent us, and then send this out to the same demand partners as before. Maybe we start on the other side first, want you, the publisher, to gather consent, to collect it, and give us this information using a CMP. But basically, you provide us the first information on the left, because you have maybe the additional information that the user is a European resident. So taking the easy route first, you know that the user is not a European resident because he registered at your site, he has a user account, etc. So you can actually give us the information. Or you don't know it, or any of the SDKs are not updated. So then it's unknown. In both cases, we will still run the detection if it is a European impression, meaning the user is currently located on European soil. If that is not the case, we actually behave as before and send it to our demand partners without the GDPR-related flags. If we determine that the impression is actually coming from European soil, then we have to fall back to context advertisement. If you gave us the information that somebody is a European resident, or you determine that somebody falls under the GDPR, we request that you send us the consent. Well, you first request the consent from a user and then send it to us. So we check if the consent is actually available, if targeted advertisement is allowed, if accessing a PII and the identifier, the advertiser identifier, is allowed, and then proceed, except for any of these consent is not given. We also check if Smaato has the consent, and again, the transparency and consent framework from the IAB will explain how this actually is transferred to us. One thing that is important to consider and to mention in case of GDPR is that it actually introduces something very similar to COPPA. In GDPR, it is stated that a minor, somebody who is below 16, is not allowed to give consent himself. So you have to be sure that is actually given by a parent. As we don't see any way in the EdTech ecosystem how you can actually make sure that a consent is given from a parent, we will actually assume, given that you send us an age and it being below 16, we also have to fall back to context advertisement. Then coming to the last column before the end, it checks basically if a DSP, any demand partner of us, has actually applied on the IAB list. If he has applied, he actually has a certain number that we can check, and we can be sure that he is fully compliant with the IAB terms and conditions and will be compliant with GDPR. In that case, we can send out the impression with consent, and then they are free to do context advertisement, but also targeted advertisement. If a demand partner does not have this IAB vendor list number, then we have to fall back to context advertisement, as we are not able to check that the demand partner is actually compliant, let's say. So I think this has been now detailed enough. There's of course certain details that we left out from this diagram, some more tweaks and details, but this is a very good high-level overview, I think. And I think also most of you hopefully agree. We got a question if there's a thing like a product certification, and meaning in the sense of apps. There is, in this sense, for the IAB, actually, that you're able to apply at the IAB, or actually your consent management provider, and then check that you're compliant with this. Going to the broader route of being GDPR compliant really heavily depends on your backend systems, and that is nothing that the IAB can actually provide in that sense. I know that there are certain providers who will give certifications like this, but that is of course out of scope of this webinar and is a very case-by-case thing that you have to determine yourself. Coming to the actual transparency and consent framework, and I hope some of the details we showed before will be a bit more clear. So I said before, every vendor has to register on the global vendor list of the IAB. This is a centralized list which is being refreshed in a very regular basis. Every vendor has to state their purpose, their privacy policy, what legal grounds they depend on in certain cases. And this list is then provided and updated from the IAB. You can actually go now to the IAB and take a look at it if you want. So number 82 is actually ours. So if you check it, please check ours. This list is versioned so that there's an actual audit trail that is provided. So you can be sure that at this certain point in time, a vendor was actually on a list and was able to get a consent. There's certain configurations that you can take so that a certain vendor is actually displayed, a purpose that you're requesting consent for. But this really depends on each CMP's implementation. The same list also includes the list of purposes. The two main ones, well, there's three that are really interesting for Smaato. Two, the most interesting ones, the accessing of the actual advertiser identifier is the actual first purpose. And then the ad distribution and requesting with this identifier is the actual purpose number 3. There's also purpose number 2, which means personalization. It is more in the direction of a DMP actually being able to match its data to the provided advertiser ID. So it can then at the end provide, for example, real numbers of reach and so on. The other 2 purposes are not of real interest in the ad tech world, but it's for measurement and general customization. Additionally, you can also add your own purposes, depending again on the actual CMP that you choose, and ask for additional things, additional purposes that you maybe identified with your legal team. So based on the full list that you just saw, or the structure of this list, and then taking the purposes and the actual vendors, the user is able to give a consent for each of these purposes and of each of these vendors. So this is how it roughly looks like. It's a very dense format. This is going into the direction of the final consent string. And a user, depending on what he actually chose, will then have this information stored and transported in the full ecosystem. So as you can see here, loads of zeros and ones, a 1 meaning somebody has a consent, a 0 meaning somebody has not a consent given. So for example, if we would get this information here, we would look up if we can transport it, for example, to the exchange number 2. Looking up in this string, there's a 0 at the position number 4. We would then actually fall back to context advertisement for this exchange. So this picture basically takes what I stated before. So given on a certain consent that is given, let's say SSP number 1, or a consent that is not given, the exchange number 2, you act accordingly. These pictures here are taken from the web reference implementation that is provided by OneCast. OneCast actually will monetize on this and provide you additional services around it. So it starts with a very simple question. So we value your privacy. You can, of course, customize it again. Give a high-level intro, and then providing, well, I do not accept, I don't want this, or I accept, or I want to have more details. And please show me the certain purposes that you want to have this data for. Then on the right, you see the details already with the actual purposes that are requested. In this case here, you see accessing a device, the actual advertiser ID, or advertising personalization. If a user chooses to actually then go to a full vendor list, he's also able to see the actual list and then select each and every vendor and select one, deselect one. So now we basically have a good view how this works in web, but well, we are in-app, and in-app is a bit different. So taking basically the same screenshots as before, but just taking it to the in-app level, we can take a mobile web approach here. And this is really just the same web reference implementation, and it works just out of the box. The only issue is if you take the real current IAB web implementation, it does not have a way to get then this consent to you as a publisher or to any SDK that is integrated. So there's a part missing, and that's where we were very involved in the IAB. So we took the IAB reference implementation and adjusted it a bit so it can actually communicate the consent that is given back. And you can actually take it yourself and host it yourself. You can customize it, the look and feel, if you take it, you're a bit limited in what you actually customize it, because you will have to adhere the IAB's terms and conditions to actually use this in a productive way with us together. But in general, you're able to change it as you want. The advantage of taking this web approach, this mobile web approach here, is you can change it actually anytime. It updates instantaneously, the UI, or if anything is otherwise updated, because they are legal updates. If you use it, you really should consider to register at the IB. So you would get the own CMP ID, and then the consent trail is fully enacted, and any demand partner can then see, this is CMP number 55, publisher number A, and he has signed this contract. Well, again, there's a part missing. We are able now to communicate it somehow back, but on the other side, the app still needs to really get the consent and hand it over to the actual vendors' SDKs. So we provided SDK wrappers to the IAB, which actually exactly do this. It includes also a certain parsing logic, which is based on the consent format. We'll store it in your app storage, and then everybody can very easily access this information and use it how they need to do it. This is the information that will be actually available for any vendor's SDK. So the first one is a CMP is present information flag. So this is an easy way for any SDK, like a Smaato SDK or a measurement SDK, to detect, there is actually something who gathers consent. So I should listen to the following information, these 4 ones listed below. If then the SDK determines, the other information is not set yet, then it knows currently it's uninitialized, so it can either wait or, for example, act in a context advertisement way, as we would do. The first information then stored there is being subject to GDPR. This is either information, again, that you provide as a publisher and will override any other information, because that is, it's a EU resident, or it's based on a detection that the CMP may be able to provide based on IP lookup, based on other information. The consent string is the actual consent string, which is the, before shown information, and we actually go into details also again there. But it's a very dense format, so it doesn't enlarge the actual requests and don't introduce any additional latency. It will also provide a parsed purpose consent and parsed vendor consents. This meaning the actual ones and zeros that you saw before, meaning that any SDK can quickly access it, see if Smaato is on the list, and then act accordingly, or Smaato is not on the list. Again, separating this information in a wrapper means even if the consent format is updated, you would not necessarily need to update each and every vendor's SDK, because if you update the IAB wrapper, it will include the parser, it will include the information if these vendors are allowed to access it or not, and parse it accordingly, even though the information was updated. Of course, any bigger change there might break this current format and need additional information to be parsed and made to be made available. But we are very confident this is already providing a very comfortable way, not updating your SDKs all the time. So this is actually now very, very detailed information. This is also stored in this consent information, and this is needed for proof of consent. So a regulator may choose to ask you for, well, where's your consent trail? Did the user actually did consent? And then with what wording was used and what language was used. So this information here is basically to be able to provide that information in case that you need to provide that to a regulator. And again, of course, you have a list of vendors, purposes, as before mentioned. So the important part is, if you choose to implement a consent framework at all, taking IABs or another, of course, you need to trigger it at some point. The IAB actually says the publisher should decide that, because the publisher has the additional information. Like before mentioned, this is an actual EU resident, and I always need a consent from this user. On the top, you see the actual transparency and consent framework policy. I'm not going to read it now. We have a few in-app specific tips, which actually are a bit more easy to implement and easier to act on. So if you do country-specific deployments in the App Store, you actually have IP detection directly there, or better, the EU resident detection. So if you only implement this actual CMP in an app and deploy it in the first version to only European Economic Area countries, then of course everybody there is subject to GDPR. And then you can leave out everybody else, and as Smaato and many others will actually then detect maybe somebody is on European soil, so then they react and act accordingly. But it's the easiest way to actually, from your point, you as a publisher, ensure that everybody who is subject to GDPR is going to fall under this consent mechanism. This current consent mechanism is actually able to also provide consent for third parties. So in case there might be a vendor that is not registered with the IAB, you can actually use a custom purpose to gather a consent. You would maybe have to then, by your own, check the actual purpose, if that is being activated, this meaning this one flag being there, and then you can take it and communicate accordingly to your third party that you might want to still use, even though they provide a no consent mechanism or a way to just have true or false. We just got the question if you have to register at the IAB. So there's two registration at the IAB currently. One is as a demand partner, as a vendor, so getting on this global vendor list. But you as a publisher, of course, don't belong on that global vendor list. If you choose to actually take this consent framework and implement it completely by your own, or take a reference implementation and use that, customize that, then you should register also at the IAB. It's a very quick process. My last information is it costs 350 euros. And you have to sign, of course, that you're adhering to the same terms and conditions as everybody else. You will be provided with your own CMP ID. And then Smaato, for example, can be very sure that you are adhering the actual policies of the transparency and consent framework. Okay. Of course, if you just implement it and everything just works, but you still likely want to have a possibility to test how this actually works, or that everything is actually correctly transported. And our SDK and our API already support the current version of the transparency and consent framework. And you can add the certain information there, use our SDK. if you have implemented any CMP or the current reference implementation, it will take that information, communicate it through. And if you configure it to the test ad space 1508 and the publisher 0, it will actually return HTML creative with a pass consent. If you actually use our SDK with the before mentioned configuration, you will be provided with this information, meaning you get a parsed version of the consent that was given. So you can choose to use the actual reference implementation, do the full loop, get this information. Here it actually shows you, well, purpose number 1, the purpose has been given, that was accessing the device ID, the advertiser ID. 3 was not given, that was targeted advertisement. And then here, number 82 is our vendor number. We have consent. Even though here in this example, we wouldn't acting on targeted advertisement. This demo functionality is still in development, so currently the picture is not 100%. Expect also more information and more past information about the other vendors very soon. But yeah, this is an easy way, I think, to actually test the full implementation that you have. We just got the question again, or well, again, we got the question regarding third parties that are not currently supported. You see the actual, any CMP will have custom purposes. So if you take these purposes and customize it, add an additional purpose, and the actual current defined one are the number 1 to 5, and you should maybe then pick a high number that you choose to implement yourself. And you just take the information that this third party wants to be requested by a user, and he gives the consent in the same manner, just as a different purpose. Maybe I briefly go back to the screenshots. So in the middle, you see a list of different purposes. And it would add just another purpose there. So if a user selects this, then it will allow this purpose, this custom purpose, and you can add this one, as I mentioned before, for example, as a advertising with vendor XYZ. And then there is, of course, no vendor from the global vendor list. If you are in that information, it will be just on that level. But you, as a publisher, have this information then available in the before mentioned fields and can do whatever you want with it. You have the information that this consent has been given, and then you can provide any other vendor that currently is not on that list at least a true or false signal. We will add some of this information to our documentation. Currently, I think it's not there yet, but this will be provided very soon. Okay, we are at the Q&A part. I think there's loads of questions. So the first question is, if the publisher is located in the European Economic Area, then does the publisher have to request consent for all its users or only for users in the European Economic Area? Depending on the legal advisor you're speaking with, you will get different answers. So I actually can't fully answer this, but if you want to be really sure and take the conservative stance, you can take a look, for example, at Facebook, who recently moved 1.5 billion of its users to a legal entity not in Europe. But again, it's one of these legal questions that you have to check with your own legal advisor. Another question that came up is, when do you have to ask for consent? That is actually completely up to you as a publisher. You might choose to never ask. Of course, in the European Economic Area, we will fall back, and many others. all others should fall back to context advertisement. But it is basically your choice how you want to monetize best. What choices do you want to give to your user? So, of course, if you take this reference implementation, you need internet connection. And then you need to check first if the internet connection is there. Next question. Does a publisher need to put a global vendor list in the privacy policy? There's lots of updates from several companies and put these and there's a list of companies added to their privacy policy. And this is if a vendor is actually just acting as a data processor. You have to share as a data controller with your user which vendors you add without him not being able to, well, first opt in. In that case, meaning a typical data processor, like any analytics provider that you actually share PII with. So as in this case here, we speak about the consent and the consent being requested. This is being then provided by the actual CMP. Of course, nobody will be, you should rather ask if you at Smaato or any other provider that you have directly implemented as a co-controller in your application. And just to be sure, you can of course add this. Next question. If a user clicks I accept on the first screen, is it the same as he checked all the boxes on the following screens? Yes, this is how the IAB reference implementation works. Okay, the next question I see here is, as a publisher, do I need to engage with a CMP or can it be done in-house? Well, the CMP will provide you with a certain legal basis. There are several ones that you can already see on the current IAB webpage. There's a list. I don't know of many who provide actually an in-app implementation, but this is of course the legally safe way because they will provide you the capability of tracking consent and so on. You do not need to do this. As I stated before, you can take any implementation, any reference implementation that is out there, or choose to completely do it on your own, and then just register at the IB. And I think I mentioned before, this is roughly 350 euros. Actually, you have to check with IB. This is just my latest information. One question is regarding ECPM in Europe. It is very hard to forecast anything in regards of this. There's been tests that show roughly 50% of users will actually give consent. This highly depends, of course, on your actually implementation, on the actual available inventory or your supply, as we call it. And we actually think that in case users will not give consent, the roughly same budget will stay still at in-app advertisement and then just shift to context advertisement. One question is regarding the ad tag. So there are some partners who implement just a so-called ad tag from us, which is then used in the primary ad server to actually request advertisements also from Smaato. So not having Smaato as a primary ad server. Also in the same reference document, there are certain macros defined. Of course, this needs to be supported by the primary ad server that you have in place first, and it needs to be able to take an IAB consent string and communicate it through to any ad tag. So in this regard, you actually have to first connect with your third-party vendor of your choice and ask them how to implement this. One different question here that I see is there a way to invoke legitimate interest to collect advertising identifiers, but no other personal information? So again, I'm not a lawyer. Ask your own legal advisor, but there is a general misunderstanding in, let's say, in the world. So there's the e-privacy directive. Our lawyer, as well as the lawyers of the IAB, determined the GDPR in conjunction with the old e-privacy directive really enforces you need consent before collecting an advertiser ID. In Germany, there is a so-called Telemediengesetz, which by its own actually might allow it. Also, again, there's different opinions. So you will see certain German vendors who will claim that this is absolutely possible, and this is only based on a German law. Again, we don't think this separated approach is really viable, and as far as I know, there has been regulators who stated that this is not something they will allow. So I really want to convince you that you should not rely on legitimate interest in this case. We're really approaching the end of this webinar. Maybe one more question. Are there any best practices example you can use to actually use or implement your own UI UX flows? There are documents from the IAB who specify this or give guidance on this, and you can rely on this. Of course, you can also just take the IAB's reference implementation as your guidance. Okay. Last question. This works for our SDK. Yes, this works for our Smaato's SDK. Is it exposed also in Smaato's server-to-server API? Yes. We added the additional parameters to our API. The documentation is updated in our wiki. You can just go there and take a look. The two additional parameters that you really need to know of are GDPR and GDPR_consent. Thank you all for attending, and see you soon.